Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's an honor for me to represent the constituents of Durham and to give my reflections today on the Liberal budget. This is their final budget, Mr. Speaker, and many Canadians are saying thank goodness for that. The promises made by this Prime Minister when he sought the trust of Canadians in 2015, the fiscal promises were broken by the Liberals within several months. Mr. Speaker, fundamental promises about when the budget would be balanced, their approach to fiscal management, to taxation, all of that was a misleading campaign with respect to what they promised to be somewhat fiscally prudent in government, and they've been nothing but. I'm calling this the bribery budget, Mr. Speaker, not because it comes so quickly after the SNC scandal, which at its heart relates to foreign influence and bribery, but this is a case where the Liberals are awash in money and are trying to bribe Canadians with their own money. And we need to point that out because it's not only reckless, it's misleading. So let's start by the numbers on the Liberal bribery budget, Mr. Speaker. They are running a $20 billion deficit in this next fiscal year. This is the fiscal year, I'd remind you, Mr. Speaker, and Canadians, where the Prime Minister said the budget would be balanced by 2019. Not only is it not balanced, he's running a $20 billion deficit in good economic times, Mr. Speaker. Very, very imprudent fiscal management because there are clouds on the horizon, Mr. Speaker, if you look at trade uncertainty and a number of things around the world. To be running reckless, out-of-control structural deficits fueled by tax increases at a time where the economy is looking like it's at a pivot point is very reckless. It puts us at a disadvantage for being responsive in the future. Remember, he promised Canadians in 2015 he would never run a deficit more than $10 billion. He would run 3 modest deficits before returning to balance in 2019. That was misleading Canadians, Mr. Speaker. He is running a deficit that's more than twice as much that he promised to ever run, Mr. Speaker. And what's particularly shameful about this fiscal train wreck under the Prime Minister and his Finance Minister is in this last year alone, they've had $27 billion of unanticipated revenues, Mr. Speaker. So they're bringing in $27 billion more as a result of their tax increases, and I will acknowledge higher employment rates because of a recovering and booming U.S. economy, Mr. Speaker. So we'd always said when we were making the difficult decisions to have a balanced budget in the years after a global recession, our economy was positioned to do well when the U.S. experienced a full recovery. The U.S. economy has been rocketing. We've been, despite some trade disruptions, seeing more employment as a result. So the government is bringing in $27 billion in unexpected revenue. But what are they doing, Mr. Speaker? They're spending it all and some. Because in this budget, the bribery budget, there's $23 billion in new spending, Mr. Speaker. So times are good. The economy's doing fairly well. Employment has been increasing, as I said, largely due to the U.S. economy, where they've been lowering taxes. This government's been raising taxes. And so we're at a pivot point where not only does the global economy look like there could be some clouds on the horizon, our competitiveness has eroded every month that Prime Minister is in office. So we see businesses relocating to the United States. I met a tax accountant, Mr. Speaker, last year in Oakville who said every client that had consulted him in the previous year had been arranging the creation of a U.S. subsidiary or have been shifting capital to their U.S. subsidiary, Mr. Speaker. So there are clouds on the horizon. So the good times may come to an end. So when your spending is outstripping even getting $27 billion in more revenue that you didn't budget for, and you're still spending $20 billion more than that, That is a failure of colossal proportions. The finance minister will have to retire to his villa in France because he won't be able to show his face on Bay Street again, Mr. Speaker. This has been an out-of-control train wreck. $23 billion in new spending, a $20 billion deficit, and in the last few years, they've raised taxes on anything that is moved. They've raised personal income taxes. They have raised taxes on seniors by cutting back tax-free savings accounts, Mr. Speaker. They've raised taxes on small businesses. There was almost a mutiny by small businesses in Canada as a result of changes that they've already signaled they want to do in terms of retained earnings and a range of things. This is why small businesses and medium-sized businesses are arranging their affairs elsewhere. But it doesn't stop there. The national carbon tax is now in place. So suppliers in the auto supply industry in Ontario, small and medium-sized ones that aren't exempt by this government, they compete against suppliers in Michigan and Pennsylvania where there's no carbon tax, Mr. Speaker. There's taxes on the Saturday night, the sharing economy, Uber, they're taxing that now. They have an escalator tax on alcohol. So they're defying parliamentary tradition, Mr. Speaker, not even coming to the legislature to ask for approval of future tax increases. They're automatically scheduling them for certain sections of the economy. And of course, they've corrected $2 billion in tariff taxes on Canadian businesses. They're killing the aluminum boats and the families that sell those, Mr. Speaker, like the Junkin family in Port Perry. They're hurting our metal fabricators across the country. On Prince Edward Island, I met with a great employer that are hurting as a result of their tariffs. This is why they're raising $27 billion more, Mr. Speaker. They've raised taxes on everything that's moved. They've made us uncompetitive. They see capital and talent going to the United States. Yet there's nothing in this budget for General Motors, for my community, Mr. Speaker. General Motors, in fact, the regional chair of Durham didn't even get a courtesy phone call from this Prime Minister until 3 weeks later. I was proud my leader was in Oshawa the next day, Mr. Speaker, to listen alongside my colleague from Oshawa. GM and Auto are suffering because of the 3 T's: taxes, tariffs, and trade uncertainty, Mr. Speaker. That is why GM is relocating to other operations in the U.S. This government was asleep at the switch when tariffs were applied. They've bumbled the NAFTA negotiations. When Mexico completes an agreement with the U.S. before Canada, who had a free trade agreement for almost a decade prior to Mexico joining the party, Mr. Speaker, it's a failure. And the Canadian training benefit, the Canada training benefit, I want to alert Canadians that that is a made-up element of this budget. I've checked with provinces. Provinces are in charge of training, Mr. Speaker. They haven't even been consulted by the Liberals on the so-called Canada training benefit. They've not consulted provinces that actually do the education training, whether it's the trades or the colleges, Mr. Speaker. They haven't consulted employers. So what is the Canada training benefit? It kind of looks like a tuition tax credit for middle age, Mr. Speaker. That's great if somebody wants to take an interest course when they're 40, but I want a training or an assistance program for people transitioning now out of the auto industry because of their incompetence, Mr. Speaker. They have not even consulted the province of Ontario. And the province is in charge of training, Mr. Speaker. There's no matching of what our economy needs with the training to meet that need and the people that need the training. That is how the Canada Jobs benefit under the Conservative government operated. There needed to be the employee, the employer, and the province at the table. This was a shell game where they have the Canada training benefit. They've talked to nobody about it. It's a few months before an election. It's a fraud, Mr. Speaker. And there was nothing else in there for productivity, to reduce taxes, to keep our competitive edge, to make sure that manufacturers in Durham can compete for jobs in the United States. With their inaction on trade and tariffs, their carbon tax, all of these things are making it hard for us to compete, Mr. Speaker. So with this budget, we see the Liberal bribery budget for all its warts. $27 billion in new revenue. They're still running a $20 billion deficit, and they've committed $22 billion in new spending with your money, Canadians. The only way to truly stop this budget, it will pass the House. The only way to truly stop the Liberal bribery budget is with a change of government on October 21st.
Question commentaire, questions and comments. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, the member opposite talks about changing this budget, and Canadians had that opportunity back on October of 2015 when they soundly rejected Stephen Harper's politics of austerity. When they take a look in terms of what it is that the Harper government was able to accomplish, Mr. Speaker, and I would challenge the member any day in an environment in which we can talk about the types of things we have done in the last 3.5 years. The hundreds of thousands, 900,000 jobs by working with Canadians, Mr. Speaker. Unlike what the member across the way tries to give a false impression on, the tax breaks that member voted against, Mr. Speaker. The tax break to Canada's middle class, the Conservative Party, including that member, voted against that, Mr. Speaker. So the member can say whatever it is that he wants to be able to say. But at the end of the day, the facts speak the truth. And the truth is 900,000 plus jobs, hundreds of thousands of children and seniors out of poverty, and the list goes on.
Member for Durham.
Mr. Speaker, I'm surprised my friend used the term false impression and referenced the 2015 election. He and his Prime Minister promised that this year we'd have a balanced budget, Mr. Speaker. I remind him to look in the budget. That's a $20 billion deficit. Their entire fiscal promise to Canadians was a false impression or incompetence. With this Prime Minister, I'm more apt to believe a bit of both, Mr. Speaker. But I'm going to invite him, I'm going to challenge my friend from Winnipeg. When he's done his roundtables at the McDonald's this Saturday, I want him to go and meet with Minister Kelvin Goertzen, the Minister of Education and Training in Manitoba, and ask, was the government of Manitoba consulted on the Canada training benefit? I know the answer, Mr. Speaker. They were not. The province, his province, Friendly Manitoba, has responsibility for training. This government has set up a Canada training benefit. They've not consulted the provinces. They've not consulted employers. Just like their plans on the fiscal side, they have no plan for our future. Our only promise for the future, whether it's in Manitoba or Ontario, is a change of government.
Question commentaire. La députée de Longueuil, Saint-Hubert.
Merci, M. le Président. J'aimerais remercier mon collègue pour son allocution et je ne peux pas m'empêcher de réagir quand j'entends le député de Winnipeg qui parle des Canadiens ont choisi la fin de l'austérité. Il y a quand même une marge gigantesque entre l'austérité et le déficit or loser dans lequel on est depuis toujours. C'est pitoyable de voir ça, puis c'est complètement irresponsable et je partage son point de vue là-dessus. J'aimerais lui demander, évidemment, je comprends très bien son souci qu'il a, par exemple, par rapport aux gens des usines de GM à Oshawa. Il n'y a pas de vision à long terme pour essayer de garder ces grandes usines chez nous et même d'en avoir plus et de fabriquer, par exemple, des modèles d'avenir au lieu de fabriquer des modèles de fin de série. On peut-tu fabriquer, M. le Président, des véhicules d'avenir qui seront promis à de belles ventes et donc à la pérennité des emplois dans ce domaine-là. Mais j'aimerais précisément demander à mon collègue s'il a vu avec sa loupe ou avec sa pelle et sa faux pour chercher dans encore cet énorme bill quelque chose de caché puis de dangereux, quelque chose parce que c'est ça le challenge qu'on nous impose à nous parlementaires ici, c'est de passer au travers d'un bottin de téléphone de fou avec une loupe pour essayer de voir tout, puis on n'a pas le temps. Puis qu'est-ce que ça a eu comme conséquence dans le dernier bill omnibus? Une espèce d'improvisation débile sur SNC-Lavalin avec les conséquences épouvantables qui en suivent pour le Québec, les jobs, l'ingénierie au Canada et, tant mieux pour eux autres, un gros scandale qui va leur nuire à la prochaine élection.
La députée de Durham.
Merci, Monsieur le Président, et merci pour la question. Il n'y a pas un choix entre austérité, Monsieur le Président, et un budget équilibre. On doit avoir un plan. Il n'y a pas un plan maintenant avec le gouvernement libéral. C'est juste des dépenses et plus des taxes et impôts. ce n'est pas un plan particulièrement pour les emplois et la usine de GM à Oshawa. Maintenant, avec les problèmes avec l'ELENA, avec plus de taxes et impôts, incluant les taxes sur le carbone, ce n'est pas possible pour une entreprise comme GM d'être compétitive entre les États à côté d'Ontario, comme Michigan, comme Pennsylvania. Et maintenant, il y a une malaise dans le secteur privé en Ontario à cause de ce gouvernement. Donc, on doit choisir une nouvelle approche en octobre avec le Parti conservateur.
Bravo, bravo.